Why is Africa finally abandoning socialism? Now, this may sound like a bold claim, but Africa is in the middle of a giant shift that could lift millions of people out of poverty over the next decade. So, what's changing? Well, for starters, there's a growing embrace of free trade across the continent at the same time that the rest of the world seems to be turning away from it. Since 2021, every single country in Africa, except for the authoritarian nation of Eritrea, has begun to reduce taxes, regulations, and barriers to trade. And the results are pretty incredible. After declining for decades, trade between African countries has increased by nearly 25% in just 3 years. And according to some estimates, that free trade alone across the continent could end up boosting Africa's GDP by $450 billion over the next 15 years. This means lifting over 30 million people out of extreme poverty and another 68 million out of moderate poverty. Free trade alone doesn't solve all the problems, and this of course doesn't mean that the rest of Africa's problems are going to just disappear overnight. Africa is still incredibly poor, with corruption, civil wars, and ethnic conflicts making the continent one of the least investable places in the world. But when we look at Africa's recent history, it's pretty amazing that nearly every country on the continent is finally considering some form of free market economics. Because for decades, African nations were held back by policies that prioritize state control over economic freedom. You could say that one of the most enduring and nefarious legacies of European colonialism was actually Marxism. In fact, it wasn't all that long ago when a huge chunk of Africa was dominated by Marxist regimes. And said governments believed that the primary cause of African poverty was a result of oppression and exploitation by colonial powers, which certainly happened, but their solution was to construct massive, centrally planned economies. And no matter where they were tried, the result was always rampant poverty and economic collapse. And while much of Africa remains very politically unstable with authoritarian and corrupt governments, the fact that Marxism is now being rejected and the continent is slowly but surely starting to look at economic freedom rather than state intervention as the key to prosperity is incredibly encouraging. So while free trade is not a magic cure-all for all of the problems facing Africa, the shift towards freer markets is a huge first step in lifting millions out of poverty. As the Ghanaian economist George Aidi once said, Africa's problems will never be solved by the same thinking that created them. And thankfully, countries across Africa are beginning to walk away from the very socialist policies that trapped an entire continent in perpetual poverty for more than 6 decades.